I chose a poet today who I actually, even though he is such a big name in Hebrew poetry, I actually really didn't know anything about him. So that was one reason why I chose him, Saul Tchernichovsky. And I had other reasons why I chose him. Like one reason is that I'm always trying to have some sort of connection to the Parsha or to the coming Parsha. And you may wonder, why did I choose a poem about a Canaanite idol if we are in between the coming together of all of Edat Israel and the Mishkan it has been built, and we say that let us go from strength to strength, and the next book that we open is the Torah Kohanim. So anything else but pagan worship, right? But I think I chose it precisely because of that, to have this sort of opposite and to give us a way to think about Canaanite worship, which, as Bible scholars tell me, is found a lot in what has become our right as well. But it's also because Tchernichovsky was, and that was very interesting to read about that. So that was the main reason why I chose this poem or hymn. But then as I read on, it became really interesting. I didn't know, and maybe most of you may know this. It was new to me that he was very anti established Judaism, and in his poetry, he has a whole series of poems where he explored pagan Canaanite worship and is writing about that and exploring the pagan world. And in that, even though he's later than the romantics of any country I can think of, in a way he is a late romantic in that he was interested in the natural world and in pagan worship because it seemed to represent a world that was free and liberated, and in the same time, romantics, by their on one hand being drawn to the older, established, idealized worlds or systems, they are somehow very conservative. And at the same time, they have this other pull of wanting to be very, very free and rebelling against the establishment. If that is maybe considered one reason, another one reason, but one sort of like example, he married a non-Jewish woman, and everyone urged him at the time to have her convert, and he said, "I'm not doing it." And so there's a lot in this poem that speaks to that, not to the thing of the wife, but to all this sort of, and we're going to look into it. But I wanted to give that as an introduction. I have more to say, and I found it. I became very interested in realizing there are a lot of interesting things to say why one chooses one thing, even more so maybe than that specific poem, and that it may be obvious. He was born in, where are my several notes? He was born in 1875, and he was born in a village at the border between Crimea and Ukraine, and which I don't think I need to say much more about. So he wrote in Russian, but he was Ukrainian, and like many poets, non-Jewish and Jewish of that time, he found himself as a young man starting out as a poet in Odessa, which was a cultural center at the time where many other like poets lived. Obviously, also Bialik had been there, and what's the other one? Ahad and other poets, and I thought it would be good to keep that in mind in terms of how Odessa was this the center where people from many different ethnicities and groups came together and celebrated art, and it was a very lively city. I brought a quote, also this being refugee Shabbat at Beth. I thought it kind of made sense to have a nod to this whole situation in Ukraine. And I brought an excerpt from a poem by Pushkin, translated into English, of course, which conjures up yet another place that has long been gone, but that also is gone there. And I just want to read it quickly. I lived then in dusty Odessa. There for a long time skies are clear. There steering an abundant trade sets up its sails. There all exhales, diffuses Europe, all glitters with the south, and brindles which life variety. Odessa, after all, wasn't everything right? Wasn't the place for Jewish poets at the time. In the end, of course, and he made his way first into Germany and then into Palestine. And I brought a quote from Robert Alter that I'm just going to read in his introduction to these poems, because it speaks also to the theme of refugee Shabbat, and with the backdrop of the Ukraine and Russia war that's going on there. Circumstances forced Tchernichovsky to be even more of a wanderer than Bialik. Because of the restrictions against admitting Jewish students, he had to study medicine outside Russia, first in Heidelberg, then in Lausanne, in Switzerland. After working within Russia as a doctor during the trying years of war and revolution, he discovered, as did everyone else connected with the Odessa literary group, that there could be no future for Hebrew writers under the Soviet regime, and he left Russia in 1922. An unsuccessful attempt to get a medical post in Palestine led to a 9-year stay in Germany, interrupted by several temporary moves in the hope of finding more satisfactory positions elsewhere in Europe. Like Bialik, Tchernichovsky managed to settle in Palestine for only the final decade of his life. So that's also a kind of refugee. And those are kind of the things I wanted to share before we look at the poem. And it is a very rigid, it's very strictly structured. It's a Petrarchan sonnet, and it talks about a woman talking to Ashtorte, who is the female, one of the Canaanite idols of fertility, basically mostly associated with. I'm going to read it, but I hope I'm not going to butcher it because it's a sonnet, so actually someone who is fluent in Hebrew should read that, but I'm going to do my best, and then I'm reading the English, and you're invited to follow along. Ashtorti li, halo tasichi li, me'an hagai elenu vat, ha'im beyat kana'ani, me'ir למעוז ים, בין גלי שבו, צידון והל צידון. הערבו לו בהר ועם ליל אלופי דן, האם בצרורות בד על דבשות גמלי דדן, ונעקות מעלות חול הפז, בניין ונידן, נישאת עם אורחת שווה, נושקת רומא כידון, ולבניהם מתחת כל רימונים וסהרון רן. נפלאות לי, מה נפלאות עינייך יסמרקדים, אף כולך אסוך שן, יצורייך כה מתלכדים, ואין איש מגלה סוד, מי נתנך לי, אין איש. סלסילת תאנים לך, חפנתי קמח סולתי, משמן זיתי לוג, אלייך התפללתי. נהגיהו נעצך, אלי תביהו חיש. The translation is from the book where they usually don't give, they leave it more open because to convey more of the Hebrew, so it's not going to be a sonnet in English. Maya Starte, won't you tell me, from where did you come to us in the valley? Was it in the hand of a merchant of Sidon, from the city stronghold of the sea, the waves of Agati and Chalcedony? Did the chieftains of Dan lie in ambush for him on the mountain and at night? Was it in bundles of linen on the humps of Dedonite camels and she-camels raising the golden sand with their swinging and swaying, and before them the sound of pomegranate bells tinkling and singing crescent ornament? Wondrous to me, how wondrous to me are your eyes that are emeralds. Indeed, all of you they have made of ivory, your limbs linked together so. And no one reveals the secret, who gave you to me, no one. A little basket of figs for you, I have scooped up my best flour. A log of my olive oil, I have prayed to you. Lead him, a shining lad, bring him to me swiftly. And he wrote that in 1917. Yes, so I thought this poem is interesting, first of all, for its all formality, but ultimately my Hebrew is not good enough to go into in-depth analysis and point out all the intricacies, what he's doing with the language. At least it's not good enough yet. But I wanted to hand it over to you in terms of how do you relate to this type of idealization of a perceived idyllic world, Brent? I don't know. He said he left Russia. Well, it says he left Russia in 1922. So either he was in Russia. Right. And the Russian Revolution. Yeah. Yeah, it's very, I'm going to sum up what you were saying and then first, so Brent made an interesting comment, which I didn't think you were going there, but I'm going to answer. No, it's great. Like 1917, it's World War I is still going on. The Russian Revolution is happening in 1917, as much as I remember. And so I thought you were going to criticize, and Brent was saying it is no wonder that, or it's not surprising that someone might want to turn away from all of that, having witnessed all of this brutality, and write a beautiful poem about a deity, basically giving life. I thought you were going to criticize him, so I'm appreciative that you pointed that you went that way, because it's a good point. Any, yes. The question is, when did he get his medical treatment? Because the war, of course, World War I was specifically brutal. I mean, not that any other war is not brutal, but we know that World War II was World War I was very, very, like a lot of. I have something else to say. Like so, it was having seen. He would have probably seen a lot of mutilated bodies on the Eastern Front, maybe even more so than on the Western Front. I don't know. Looking at this quote from from Alto. So when he got his training as a doctor after working within Russia as a doctor, so he must have had during the trying years of war and revolution. So it says here, so he was already trained as a doctor, and he had during the years of the war and the revolution. So there's an Austrian writer, Georg Trakl, who writes he's Austrian, but he's considered also German because he wrote in German, and he was in World War One, and there are a lot of those poets at the time who witnessed all this, the onslaught of the trenches, and turned to write very, very, very pessimistic, dark poetry. To your point, Kendra Chorney. Yeah, that's a great question. The question for those on Zoom is what do we know about why, basically? So several Hebrew poets writing in Hebrew write about topics that could potentially even be, considered more than anti. There would be like, yeah, heretical. I don't know. I wish I could answer that. My guess is that. My guess is that especially those people in the turn of the 19th century, like from the 1800s to the 1900s, those poets who came to Palestine, I think they had gone through so much hardship, and they did believe he believed in Palestine, right? Also, like Alter says that some of the best work of his last years was a response to the physical presence of the land of Israel and to the efforts of its rebuilders. So I would guess maybe it's a Zionistic interest, but a loss of faith in the traditional God of Israel. I read that Tchernichovsky did not go through a traditional education, like starting in the Cheder, like Bialik did, for example. So he may have always had a different sort of perspective, but obviously he's not the only one. So I think there's a tension between the religion and the land that is always there, and that probably was very, very pronounced then. I don't know your name. Sorry, Jason. Yeah. Right, Newell, yeah. Neualt. So Jason sort of supported and added new perspectives to what we've been talking about in terms of how it makes sense historically that a lot of people who came to Palestine saw themselves as Jews who didn't feel bound by religion, but they wanted to do something new, and would not write about religious faith. Whereas then there are other poets, especially in later years, that virtuously sort of combine these work of secular and erotic poetry, and but using a lot of playing on the keyboard of religion. Another thought that I had in terms of maybe he is just, I have been looking at this side a lot. Is there anybody who wanted to say something? Okay, so looking at the poem and like sort of having in mind what he was interested in, it also kind of makes sense, if one wants to say, or is like in character. There's this person who's interested in poets like Keats and Nietzsche and all these people who worship nature. Like part of romantic poetry, like in the period, and what is considered romantic poetry, is the worship of nature, right? Is the worship of nature as sort of like expression of freedom and of forces unbound and of anti-establishment, and all these things are you find in what's considered not, established religion, if you want to find it. And the other thing is, as I said, this conflict also between that the romantics have, I find, in way of, yes, they're always looking for like a different ideal utopian state of life or of nature, and at the same time they're interested in like the perfect shape of a Greek urn, or he has something too about an Apollon statue, and this sort of idealization of art as the perfect representation of nature, and at the same time they often fall also in the trap of worshiping too much of yes, this ideal, and making it exotic. Like on one hand, one in the poem, when we look about the caravan and the pomegranate belts, which actually I found obviously very interesting, because we have the pomegranate belts in the priestly garment. So there's a hint of that, and maybe because it is just so we can't separate it. It has potentially pagan, origins, and it's a fertility image, and the priests in the temple walk around with it. Like it's very interesting. Did you want to say something? Okay. Right. Yes, exactly. That's why it fits in this Havdalah. Yes. Right. Right. Hmm. Yep. There's so many interesting things in it. I'm gonna hard to summarize this for the folks on Zoom. Basically, question: was he a product and a poem of his time? Well, in that he, or was he even a foreshadowing what has happened for most of the 20th century in Israel? That people are really interested in archaeology, and he is sort of writing about that and putting like, that into focus. And I want to say yes, yes, in a way, but on the other hand, I also think that he idealizes the past. It's some of these descriptions to us, like this whole idealization of exotic Oriental caravans, and it has a lure, but also in that time there were a lot of cliches about it, and so I don't know if he was that type of poet who can be grouped into that. I do think that the interest in archaeology in Israel is very much can be seen for certain people just like as a confirmation of turning away from religion because it's archaeology and it's science and people have different ways of how they weigh one another. I think he was probably proud of his time in the way that he came to Palestine in the years that he did with the historic context that he carried with him and what that meant for his life. I think in terms of the poetry, at least that's what I've read about him and the poems that I've read beyond this, he seems to be emulating actually something that is a little bit gone in his sort of way to romanticize bygone eras. But I really liked, it, and it has come through in what several people have said in terms of how he turns to this fertility deity in a time of rebuilding, populating, and having seen tremendous loss. And I think that's a good moment to end on. I just thought of that. So I gave another poem on the source sheet actually, which is from an Australian romantic poet who also not Jewish, who writes about Ashtarte, Asherah, whatever it's several names. I'm not going to read it. It's very long, and I just gave it. It was interesting how, to the point of, there was a romantic Australian non-Jewish poet writing about the Canaanite fertility goddess. So anyway, that's it. Thanks for coming.